Topkapi Palace stands today as a museum polished and admired by visitors who walk through its grand corridors, peer into its ornate chambers, and marvel at its domes. Yet few pause to wonder about the hidden history contained within its walls. For over 3 centuries, from the mid-1400s to the early 1700s, this palace was not only the center of imperial power, but also the core of a system built on control and transformation. It housed sultans, viziers, and foreign emissaries, but behind its ceremonial halls and official spaces existed a hidden world, a world rarely recorded in history. Thousands of boys passed through its gates, taken from distant provinces of the empire. They weren't brought to visit, they were brought to disappear. The devshirme system, a state-administered program, gathered Christian boys, usually between the ages of 8 and 16, from conquered territories and delivered them to the capital. The justification for this system was advancement. The promise was education, but the reality was far darker. It was a complete removal from their families, their languages, their names. The palace absorbed them as mere inputs, their origins irrelevant, only their potential to be reshaped by the empire mattered. Topkapi Palace was designed to impress from the outside, but within it was built to contain. Its architecture mirrored the imperial logic, concentric courtyards narrowing access layers of protocol, each gate more exclusive than the last. Physical space mirrored social order. Those closest to power were buried deepest inside, hidden, controlled, and constantly watched. Security was absolute. Movement was monitored. Privacy did not exist. Entry was easy, but exit was nearly impossible. The structure itself enforced hierarchy. The deeper one ventured, the further they were removed from the outside world. For those who entered as children, that world was erased almost immediately. Official records focus on sultans and ceremonies, but they fail to mention how many boys entered the palace's lower dormitories, how many advanced, or how many vanished. What is clear, however, is this: the palace was more than a royal residence. It was a self-contained mechanism for producing loyal servants and silencing any hint of deviation. Its perfection wasn't aesthetic, it was functional. What remains today are gleaming surfaces, marble floors, gilded ceilings, and symmetrical gardens. These are preserved, admired, and polished, but the lives that were once absorbed into those surfaces, processed and erased, remain absent by design. The building remains flawless. The history does not. Before we continue exploring what life inside the Ottoman palace truly meant for the boys taken within its walls, consider subscribing and liking this video. If you value history told without filters, the kind of stories rarely found in textbooks, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It's incredible how, despite our diverse backgrounds, we're all united by a shared need to understand what history truly cost those who had no say in it. The boys arrived in droves, some by foot, others by cart, many by force. Some marched for weeks across mountains and rivers, while others were handed over by local authorities. Their entry into Topkapi Palace marked the end of one life and the complete erasure of their past. The system didn't punish them, it redesigned them. The intake process was methodical. Each boy was examined by imperial officials who showed no interest in identity, only in usability. Their teeth were checked for health, their skin inspected for scars or blemishes, their proportions measured, and their facial symmetry noted. Their age was estimated, strength and alertness tested in silence. Intelligence was not valued for self-expression, but for adaptability. The goal was not empowerment. It was to predict which boys would submit most easily to transformation. This wasn't violence, it was administration. The boys weren't given names, they were assigned roles. Their records listed dimensions, not stories. Some boys with sharp features and composed mannerisms were selected for palace training. Others were sent to the Janissary Corps. A few were rejected outright, deemed too weak, too old, or too difficult to mold. Their fate was never recorded. The chosen ones, the most promising candidates for palace service, were separated immediately. Their clothes were stripped away, their hair was cut, and any personal item was taken. Trinkets or religious symbols were confiscated. The boys were given plain uniforms, a bed assignment, and a new name. These were the first steps in their conversion, not just to Islam, but to function. The state didn't merely demand religious loyalty, it required a psychological disassembly. After intake, the boys were relocated to dormitories where rows of iron-framed beds were pressed against stone walls, each identical and each space carefully measured. There was no privacy, no variation, and no softness. Surveillance was constant and punishment was immediate. The next step in their transformation was the destruction of their native tongue. Speaking their mother language was forbidden. Caught speaking it, the boys faced isolation beatings or loss of food privileges. One boy caught whispering a prayer in his native language during morning washing before sunrise was dragged into the courtyard, stripped to the waist and tied to a vertical post. He was beaten with a flat wooden paddle until his back opened, the punishment public, silent and sustained. The guards took turns maintaining rhythm and strength. No one spoke during the beating. When it ended, he collapsed without a sound and was carried away. 3 days later, he returned, unable to lift his arms, unable to speak. All prayers were to be conducted in Arabic, while Turkish became the mandated language for every command, conversation, and lesson. Any other language, even those whispered or remembered, was completely banned. Fluency was not the goal. Herisher, another boy, was found clutching a scrap of embroidered cloth hidden in the lining of his bedding, a piece of fabric from his mother's dress. He was not beaten. Instead, he was made to kneel in the middle of the meal hall for 10 consecutive days, eating from the floor. He was not permitted to speak, and no one was allowed to speak to him. When he cried, he was ignored. When he stopped crying, he was moved to a corner bed at the edge of the dormitory where light never reached. The cloth was burned in front of him. Daily routine replaced thought wake before dawn prayer, information recitation, physical training, memorization, menial labor, short meals, inspections, more prayer. There were no breaks, no time for a reflection. Every movement was choreographed, timed and measured. A wrong step during marching drills meant loss of rations. A mispronounced verse meant cleaning latrines alone. Discipline wasn't reactive, it was constant. Older students were assigned to monitor the younger ones, their loyalty to the system proven through their strictness. Infractions were reported instantly, some were even invented. A misplaced tunic became an accusation of insubordination, a moment of hesitation framed as defiance. False reports were not punished, as indifference to truth was part of the training. Food was rationed based on performance. Water could be denied without justification. Sleep was conditional. Blankets were removed during correction weeks and nights grew cold. The dormitory walls trapped the chill, turning bodies into stone. Coughing was discouraged. Shivering was punished. One boy sneezed during a recitation drill and was made to stand outside in the winter courtyard for an entire night. There were no screams. Screaming was considered theatrical and disruptive. Pain had to be endured silently. Those who cried too often were removed. They did not return. Their names were struck from the roll, their belongings redistributed, and their beds reassigned. One boy once attempted to escape. He made it past the second gate before being caught by the outer guards. His punishment was instructional. He was tied upright at the central gate, facing outward. Eyes open, feet bound, posture fixed for 2 full days. Every student in the program passed by him in silence, morning and night. By the 3rd morning, he was gone. No announcement was made. His absence was never discussed. No one inside the palace questioned where he had gone. They had already rehearsed what silence meant. By the end of the first month, most boys no longer remembered what it felt like to resist. They learned quickly that emotion was dangerous. Nostalgia invited punishment, anger drew attention, even friendship carried risk. They adapted not by embracing the system, but by becoming invisible within it. Obedience was not a virtue, it was a defense mechanism. The system presented itself as civilized. It used no chains left, no visible wounds. It spoke of literacy, discipline, and upward mobility, but its core function was erasure, removing the self and replacing it with performance. Everything was watched. Everything was managed. Over time, most boys stopped noticing what they had lost. Obedience was not taught, it was carved in. Once obedience had been drilled into their posture, their routines, and their silence, the boys faced a new layer of expectation, one that was not announced in training but understood without instruction. It wasn't part of their official duties. It was not part of their curriculum, but it shaped their futures more decisively than any lesson in literature or law. The first signs of this shift appeared in how they were observed. Supervisors, eunuchs, instructors, and senior students began to notice more than behavior. They evaluated faces, skin, body language. How a boy walked, how his voice sounded when answering a question, how he responded to correction. Those who held their gaze slightly longer, or kept their heads down but moved with self-awareness, were remembered. One evening a boy was told to remain behind after prayer. He was led to a bathing chamber, ordered to wash dressed in silk robes instead of the usual coarse uniform, and taken through a corridor he had never seen before. A door was opened, and he was pushed inside. The official waiting there was older, seated already watching. The boy was told to undress. He hesitated, and the eunuch accompanying him struck him across the mouth without a word. The hesitation did not happen again. No record was kept of what occurred in that chamber, and no accusation was filed. The next morning the boy returned to his dormitory, bruises hidden under his clothing, and a new pair of leather slippers placed at the foot of his bed. At breakfast he was served first. That was the lesson: those who allowed their bodies to be taken were compensated in food, clothing, leniency, and favour. They were moved to warmer sleeping quarters, received tutoring from palace officials directly, and were permitted to rest while others scrubbed latrines. It was not declared policy. It did not need to be. Everyone saw the pattern. The boys who resisted did not vanish immediately, but their advancement slowed. They were marked as difficult given exhausting shifts, and their errors, however minor, were punished more harshly. One boy who struck a guard's hand away during an attempted assault was restrained by 3 eunuchs, beaten until he vomited, and then confined to a storeroom with no bedding for 2 weeks. When he returned, he no longer fought. Among the boys, some adapted quickly. They learned to smile without meaning it, to accept what was required, to speak softly when summoned. Others began initiating the dynamic themselves, offering silence, flattery, obedience with just enough invitation to be noticed. Those who could read the desires of those above them advanced the fastest. They were described in reports as disciplined, mature, favoured. The most attractive boys, those with facial symmetry, clear skin, and passivity mistaken for grace, became regular objects of attention. Some were kept apart, entirely reserved for high-ranking officials or guests. These boys disappeared from the dormitory system altogether and were rarely seen again. Their names remained on the rolls, but their roles were no longer listed. This was not incidental. It was systematic. The palace did not create a culture of sexual exploitation by accident. It created a closed world where bodies were currency, and access to those bodies was a form of unspoken privilege. Eunuchs, often castrated in childhood, were both enforcers and intermediaries. Their trauma had become their authority. There was no safe path to resist. Resistance meant punishment, isolation, or erasure. To comply meant advancement at the cost of oneself. To initiate meant survival wrapped in complicity. The palace rewarded silence. It cultivated forgetfulness, and for those who could no longer forget what had been done to them, it offered power, the chance to do it to someone else. The system did not need to recruit abusers, it produced them. Boys who survived the early years of training, discipline, and submission were eventually placed into supervisory roles over those younger than themselves. These were not honours, they were tests. The palace needed to know which boys had learned not just to obey, but to enforce, not just to endure power, but to replicate it. They were given small privileges, better food, lighter chores, the right to speak during inspections, and in return they were expected to maintain order. The first sign of success was how easily they could deliver punishment: a slap for lateness, a kick for disobedience, a report fabricated to eliminate a rival. The transition from victim to enforcer was rarely dramatic. It was incremental. It felt like relief, and then came the second layer. A senior student, no older than 16, took a new boy into his care. He showed him the rules, corrected his posture, and helped him with Arabic recitation. Then one night he entered the boy's sleeping space, touched his arm, and told him he was beautiful. The boy did not respond. The senior leaned closer and whispered, "No one protected me. I will protect you." He stayed the night. The next morning the boy had been moved to a new bed closer to the supervisor's corner. He received meat in his stew for the first time in weeks. He was exempted from chores. He stopped speaking to the other boys. The student who had once been abused was now assigning beds, recommending punishments, and choosing which boy would accompany him on errands. When a younger boy refused his advances, he reported him for disrespect and ensured he was sent to scrub latrines in the cold. There were no protests, no consequences. This was not vengeance, it was assimilation. No one told these older boys what to do. No one needed to. They had learned that protection was power, and power within this institution was exercised through bodies. They remembered the rooms they were once taken to, the way no one spoke afterward, and the gifts they were given. They understood that the line between punishment and privilege had always been thin. Now they were the ones drawing it. Some hesitated at first. They paused before touching a younger boy, apologizing afterward. But the system rewarded those who stopped hesitating. It promoted those who carried out abuse cleanly, discreetly, without disruption. Those who felt guilt were ignored. Those who asked questions were reassigned. Those who completed rose. Over time, the line between what they had suffered and what they inflicted disappeared. They stopped thinking of it as violation. It became mentorship, advancement, a way to shape discipline, a rite of passage. They had survived, and now they delivered. There were boys who refused. Some broke down, some ran, and some were made examples of, but most adapted not because they were evil, but because survival required conversion. And once they converted, they became indispensable to the palace. They maintained the unspoken economy of bodies, ensured continuity without written rules, and reproduced the system without instruction. By the time a new cohort arrived, the transformation was complete. The older students no longer saw children. They saw currency. They did not see themselves in the terrified faces of the new arrivals. They saw tools, reminders of who they once were before they learned how to control someone else, so they would never again be controlled. The boys who remained long enough to graduate from the inner system were not the same boys who had entered. Their original names had long since been replaced by Ottoman names, common, repeatable, interchangeable. Their places of origin were no longer recorded. Their religions were overwritten. Their memories blurred by repetition, fear, and deprivation. By the end of their training, most no longer spoke their native tongue, not from choice, but because it no longer surfaced in thought. Some could not remember the name of their village or the faces of their families. One boy, when asked in the language he once knew, stared blankly as if spoken to in code. What had once defined him, faith language blood, had been filtered out like impurities removed from a solution. The palace did not just suppress identity, it rewrote it. Those who completed training were assigned roles in the empire: scribes, advisors, translators, tax collectors, military officers. On paper, they were success stories, intelligent, loyal, capable, fluent in Ottoman protocol. But nothing of who they were remained. They served not as men with histories, but as instruments with credentials. Their function had survived, their personhood had not. Some rose to high office, a few became viziers. But even at the peak of power, they existed as creations of the institution, not individuals with sovereign will. Their authority was contingent. Their pasts were buried. Their obedience was rewarded, not their identity. They had influence over policy, but no control over legacy. No matter how far they climbed, they were never permitted to fully belong. They were trusted tools, sharp, effective, and ultimately disposable. Many never reached such heights. They were assigned to remote provinces. Some died in service, others vanished from the records. Their names appeared once in assignment ledgers and nowhere else. They were absorbed into the bureaucratic bloodstream of the empire, forgotten by the system that had manufactured them, and by the world that had once mourned their loss. There was no path back. Those who attempted to return to their homelands often found themselves unrecognizable to the people they had once known. Their accents had become foreign, their customs Ottoman. Their new names carried weight but no affection. Some were rejected, some were suspected, and some simply left again, unable to reconcile what had been done to them with the world that had allowed it to happen. The most damaged were not the broken ones, they were the reshaped. Some still carried the scars of abuse beneath their robes, psychological, physical, sexual, but those were not the boys who disappeared. The ones who truly vanished were the ones who had adapted perfectly, who had accepted the system so completely that nothing of the former self remained. They enforced order, trained replacements, and passed along the rituals of subjugation with the detachment of routine. They were efficient, they were trusted, and they were hollow. No monument listed their names. No ceremony marked their passage. Their role in the empire's machinery was real, but their existence as human beings had been erased at the root. They lived, acted, and died as derivatives of the institution that consumed them. They were remembered only in balance sheets, payrolls, and inventories numbers in ledgers, not stories in memory. The palace had promised them elevation. What it delivered was substitution. Topkapi Palace still stands. Its walls have been cleaned, its chambers restored. The marble floors, once marked by the footsteps and blood, are now polished for visitors. Tour groups pass through its halls, listening to guides speak of Ottoman architecture, imperial administration, and artistic patronage. They learn about sultans and ceremonies, genius in governance and greatness. They are not told what else happened here. No sign within the palace mentions the children taken from villages across the empire's periphery. No display describes the selection process that began with a forced march and ended in a cell without light. No plaque lists the names of those who entered the inner quarters as boys and exited years later, as men reshaped beyond recognition. No room is dedicated to the thousands who never existed at all. The surfaces remain immaculate. The history does not. Palace records still exist, lists of recruits, rosters of appointments, memoranda on training efficiency, but they contain no descriptions of what boys endured in the dormitories. They say nothing of the sexual economy that traded obedience for advancement. They admit the beatings, the enforced conversions, and the disappearances, but do not mention the sound of wood striking flesh, or the silence that followed. They do not record what the boys whispered to one another at night when no one was listening, or what they stopped whispering once they learned that no one ever would. Modern audiences celebrate the Endrin school as a model of elite education. They speak of meritocracy, noting how many grand viziers came from humble origins. They forget what those origins were. They forget the cost. They forget that the system did not elevate boys from nowhere. It erased who they had been, replaced them with instruments, and then praised the result. The boys who adapted most perfectly left no legacy of themselves. Their accomplishments were credited to the empire. Their voices were overwritten by reports written by others. Their survival was interpreted as success, and their silence as loyalty. What they endured was never questioned. It was buried inside the story of imperial glory. The palace today is a museum. Its tour guides wear uniforms. Its displays describe weaponry, textiles, and calligraphy. Visitors take photographs of the throne room and the gardens. They marvel at the craftsmanship and admire the domes. They walk through rooms where children were once assaulted, trained, beaten, and reshaped, and they say nothing because the silence has been preserved more carefully than the truth. The system is gone, but the architecture remains, and within that architecture, the memory of what was done not to enemies but to children under imperial care has been sealed behind curated language and golden ornament. The walls are beautiful. They're also complicit. This was not simply cruelty, it was process. It was not an accident of power, it was its design. There will be no restitution. There will be no apology. The boys are gone. Their names were removed. Their lives were shortened and their futures consumed. The institution that created them no longer speaks of them, but the silence it left behind still echoes flawless, polished, untouched. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.